The elevator doors opened on the 32nd floor, and Vernon stepped out with his cleaning cart. It was 7:45 inches the evening, and the offices of Whitfield Financial Group were almost empty, just the way he liked it. For 11 years, this had been his routine. Clock in at 6. Start from the top floor. Work his way down. Empty the trash. Wipe the desks. Vacuum the carpets. Mop the floors. And most importantly, stay invisible. Vernon was 54 years old, with gray hair that had started thinning at the temples and hands that shook slightly when he wasn't paying attention. He wore the same navy blue uniform every day. The one with his name stitched in white thread above the pocket. Most people never bothered to read it. To them, he was just the janitor, or the cleaning guy, or sometimes just a nod as they walked past, already looking at their phones. He didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it that way. Tonight, the corner office on the 32nd floor still had its lights on. Vernon paused outside the glass door and saw a woman inside, hunched over her laptop, papers scattered across her desk like fallen leaves. She was talking into her phone, her voice sharp and tired at the same time. That was the CEO. Everyone knew who she was. The woman who had built this company from a small accounting firm into one of the biggest financial groups in the city. The newspapers called her the Iron Lady of Wall Street. The employees called her other things, but never to her face. Vernon had cleaned her office hundreds of times. She had never once looked at him. He moved on to the next office, pushing his cart quietly down the hall. The wheels squeaked a little, and he made a mental note to oil them tomorrow. Small things mattered in this job. Small things were all he had left. As he worked, his mind drifted the way it always did during these quiet hours. Back to a time when his life looked completely different. Back to concert halls and standing ovations. Back to the feeling of a piano beneath his fingers. The way the music used to pour out of him like water from a spring. That was 30 years ago, another lifetime. Vernon had been 24 when people started calling him a prodigy. He had earned a full scholarship to one of the best music schools in the country. His teachers said he had a gift. Something rare, something that couldn't be taught. He was supposed to perform at Carnegie Hall. He was supposed to tour Europe. He was supposed to become one of the great pianists of his generation. But life doesn't care about supposed to. It happened on a rainy night in October. Vernon was driving home from a rehearsal when a pickup truck ran a red light. He didn't even see it coming. One moment he was thinking about the Chopin piece he would perform the following week. The next moment, there was glass everywhere, and his right hand was crushed against the steering wheel. The doctors did what they could. 3 surgeries. Months of physical therapy. They saved his hand, but they couldn't save his dream. The nerves were too damaged. He could still move his fingers, but the precision was gone. The control was gone. And worst of all, a permanent tremor had settled into his right hand, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. He tried to play again. Of course he tried. But every note came out wrong. Shaky. Broken. It was like trying to paint with a brush that had lost half its bristles. The music was still in his head, perfect and beautiful, but his hands could no longer bring it to life. So he stopped. He packed away his sheet music. He sold his piano. He took whatever jobs he could find to pay the medical bills. And slowly, year by year, he buried the musician he used to be, until most days he almost forgot that person had ever existed. Almost. Vernon finished the 32nd floor and took the elevator down to the executive lounge on 30. This was his least favorite room to clean, and he always saved it for last. The lounge was designed to impress. Leather couches, a fully stocked bar, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city skyline. And in the corner, next to a potted plant that Vernon watered every Tuesday, sat a grand piano. It was a Steinway, Model D. Concert Grand. The kind of instrument that cost more than Vernon would earn in 10 years. According to the small plaque on its side, it had been donated to the company 5 years ago. in loving memory of someone whose name Vernon had never bothered to remember. No one ever played it. In 11 years, he had never once seen anyone sit at that bench. The piano was just decoration, like an expensive painting or a fancy sculpture. Something to make rich people feel cultured when they sip their whiskey after a long day of making money. Vernon hated that piano, not because it was beautiful, and not because it reminded him of what he had lost. He hated it because it was being wasted. A Steinway Model D was meant to be played. It was meant to fill rooms with sound, to make people cry and laugh and feel things they couldn't put into words. Instead, it just sat there, gathering dust, silent and useless. He cleaned around it quickly, the way he always did, trying not to look at the keys. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was because the office was emptier than usual. Maybe it was because he was tired and his guard was down. Or maybe it was because he had gotten a call from the doctor that morning, and the news about his wife wasn't good, and he needed to feel something other than fear for just a few minutes. Whatever the reason, Vernon found himself standing in front of the piano, his cleaning rag forgotten in his hand. The bench was polished mahogany. He pulled it out slowly, wincing at the sound it made against the marble floor. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he sat down. His heart was pounding, his hands were shaking, but that was nothing new. They always shook now. He lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys. White and black, stretching out before him like an old friend he hadn't seen in decades. He flexed his fingers, feeling the stiffness in his joints, the slight crookedness where the bones had healed wrong. This is stupid, he told himself. You can't play anymore. You'll just make a fool of yourself. But there was no one here to hear, no one to judge. Just him and this beautiful, neglected instrument. Vernon took a deep breath. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingertips. And then, for the first time in 30 years, he began to play. The first note was wrong. Too soft, too hesitant. His right hand trembled, and the sound came out shaky. But he kept going. He played Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, one of the last pieces he had performed before the accident. His fingers remembered the notes, even if his nerves had forgotten how to cooperate. It was broken. It was imperfect. There were mistakes everywhere, places where his damaged hand couldn't keep up with what his brain was telling it to do. But it was music, and somewhere in the building, someone was listening. Eleanor had been staring at the same spreadsheet for 45 minutes. The numbers blurred together. Columns of profit margins and quarterly projections that used to excite her but now just felt like noise. She rubbed her eyes and checked the time on her computer. 8:47 p.m. Another late night. Another dinner missed. Another evening alone in this corner office that most people would kill for. She was 61 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time she had taken a real vacation. A weekend off. Even a full night's sleep. There was always another deal to close. Another crisis to manage, another fire to put out. That was the price of building an empire. At least, that's what she told herself. The city sparkled outside her window, a million lights spread out below her like scattered diamonds. She had worked her entire life to get this view. And now that she had it, she felt nothing. Her phone buzzed. Another email. Another problem. She picked it up, ready to type out a response, when something made her stop. Music. Faint at first, almost like she was imagining it. But no. There it was. Piano music. Drifting up from somewhere below. Soft and sad. Like someone crying in a language she had almost forgotten. Eleanor set down her phone. She stood up from her desk, her knees protesting after hours of sitting, and walked to her office door. The music was louder in the hallway. It was coming from downstairs, from the executive lounge. Who would be playing the piano at this hour? The lounge was supposed to be empty. Everyone had gone home hours ago. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she didn't want to make noise. Maybe she didn't want to break whatever spell had been cast over the building. The music pulled her forward like a thread, each note tugging at something deep inside her chest. When she reached the lounge, she stopped in the doorway. The janitor was sitting at the piano. She recognized him, sort of. The older man with the gray hair and the navy uniform. She had seen him around the building for years, always in the background, always invisible. She had never learned his name. She had never thought to ask, but now she couldn't look away. His eyes were closed, and his hands moved across the keys with a strange, broken grace. His right hand trembled badly, and she could see him struggling to keep up with the music. There were mistakes, notes that came out wrong or too late, places where his fingers stumbled. But somehow, none of that mattered. The music was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had heard in years. Not because it was perfect, because it wasn't. There was something raw about it. Something honest. It sounded like heartbreak and hope mixed together. Like someone pouring their entire soul onto those black and white keys. She knew this piece. Chopin. Her son used to play it. The thought hit her like a punch to the stomach, and suddenly her eyes were burning. She blinked hard, trying to push the memories away, but they came flooding back anyway. Sunday afternoons in their old house. Her son at the piano, practicing for hours while she pretended to read in the next room. The way he would look up and smile when he finally got a difficult passage right. That was 23 years ago. Before the diagnosis. Before the hospitals. Before she buried her only child at 19 years old and decided she would never let herself feel that kind of pain again. Eleanor had built walls after that. Thick, high walls made of work and ambition and cold professionalism. She had told herself it was strength. She had told herself it was necessary, but standing here now, listening to this broken music from this invisible man, she realized those walls had become a prison. The piece ended. The last note hung in the air for a moment, then faded into silence. The janitor opened his eyes, and then he saw her. His reaction was immediate. He jumped up from the bench so fast he nearly knocked it over, his face a mask of fear and embarrassment. His hands were shaking even worse now, and he couldn't seem to decide whether to look at her or look at the floor. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have. I know I'm not supposed to. I'll get my things and go." He moved toward his cleaning cart, head down, shoulders hunched like a man expecting to be struck. "Wait." The word came out of Eleanor's mouth before she could think about it. The janitor froze. She walked into the room slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She could feel him watching her, terrified, waiting for the anger, the lecture, the threat of termination. That's what he expected. That's what everyone expected from her. Instead, she sat down on one of the leather couches facing the piano. "Please," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, softer than usual, almost vulnerable. "Keep playing." The janitor stared at her like she had just spoken in a foreign language. "Ma'am? That piece you were playing, Chopin's Nocturne." She paused, swallowing hard. "My son used to play it. Before he passed away." She didn't know why she said it. She never talked about her son. Not to anyone. Not to her colleagues. Not to her board members. Not even to the therapist she had stopped seeing 15 years ago. It was the one door she kept permanently locked. But something about this moment, this man, this music, had picked that lock without asking permission. The janitor's expression changed. The fear melted away, replaced by something else. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. The look of someone who knew what it meant to carry a loss so heavy you could barely stand up straight. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Thank you." Eleanor looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. They were trembling slightly, and she wondered when that had started. "How long have you played?" "Since I was 7. He paused. "But I stopped 30 years ago. There was an accident. My hand." He held up his right hand, and she could see the faint scars, the way his fingers curved slightly wrong. "I couldn't play anymore. Not the way I used to." "But you just did." "That wasn't real playing." He shook his head. "That was just... I don't know what that was." I saw the piano sitting here, and I couldn't help myself. It's been so long. Eleanor looked at the Steinway, really looked at it, for the first time in years. She had purchased it after her son died. She told the board it was for company events, for client entertainment, for ambiance. But the truth was, she had bought it because she couldn't bear to let go of the music completely. She needed to know that somewhere, a piano was waiting, even if no one ever played it, and now someone had. The janitor. The invisible man she had walked past 1,000 times without ever seeing. It was real, she said. What you played. It was the most real thing I've heard in a very long time. No, the janitor didn't respond. He just stood there, looking at her with those tired, kind eyes, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Crack, like a window letting in light for the first time in decades. What's your name? She asked. He seemed surprised by the question. Vernon, ma'am. Vernon. She tried out the name, letting it settle. I'm Eleanor. Would you sit back down? Please? I'd like to hear you play something else. If you don't mind. He hesitated. She could see the war happening behind his eyes. Fear versus hope. Shame versus longing. The voice that told him he didn't belong here versus the voice that remembered what it felt like to make music. Finally, slowly, he walked back to the piano and sat down on the bench. What would you like to hear? He asked. Eleanor thought for a moment. Then she said, Whatever you need to play. Vernon nodded. He placed his trembling hands on the keys. And as the first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the room, Eleanor let the tears fall without wiping them away. For the first time in 23 years, she let herself feel. The Moonlight Sonata faded into silence, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city hummed outside the windows, distant and unaware of what was happening in this room. Eleanor wiped her face with the back of her hand, not caring how she looked. Vernon sat at the piano bench with his hands resting on his knees, staring at the keys like they were old friends he had finally found again. That was beautiful, Eleanor said finally. Her voice was hoarse from crying. Even with the mistakes. Maybe because of them. Vernon let out a small laugh, the kind that didn't have much humor in it. My teachers would have disagreed. They used to say perfection was the only standard worth pursuing. Your teachers sound exhausting. They were. He paused. But they weren't wrong. Not back then. Back then, I could actually give them perfection. Or close to it. Eleanor stood up from the couch and walked over to the bar. She poured herself a glass of water, then held up the pitcher toward Vernon. He shook his head. She took a long drink and then leaned against the counter, studying him. Tell me about the accident, she said. If you want to, you don't have to. Vernon was quiet for a moment. Then he turned on the bench so he was facing her, his back to the piano. It was October, he began. 30 years ago. I was 24. I had just gotten back from a rehearsal at the concert hall. I was supposed to perform Chopin at a big showcase the following week. Agents were going to be there. Critics. It was supposed to be my big break. He looked down at his right hand, flexing the fingers slowly. It was raining. Not hard, just a steady drizzle. I was driving home, going over the music in my head. I remember thinking about this one passage in the third movement that I couldn't quite get right. I was so focused on that stupid passage. His voice grew quieter. I didn't see the truck until it was too late. The guy ran a red light. They told me later he had been drinking. But honestly, it doesn't matter anymore. The point is, 1 second I was thinking about Chopin, and the next second my car was spinning and there was glass everywhere. Eleanor didn't say anything. She just listened. My right hand got crushed against the steering wheel. The doctors said I was lucky I didn't lose it completely. Lucky. He laughed again. That same humorless sound. They did 3 surgeries, months of physical therapy. They saved the hand, but the nerves were too damaged. I couldn't control my fingers the way I used to. And this tremor started. He held up his hand, and she could see it shaking slightly. It never went away. Did you try to play again, after you healed? Of course I tried, every day for almost a year. But it was like... He struggled to find the words. It was like I could hear the music perfectly in my head, but my hands couldn't translate it anymore. Every note came out wrong, shaky, broken. It was torture. Listening to myself fail over and over again. So you stopped. So I stopped. He nodded. I sold my piano, packed away all my sheet music, took whatever jobs I could find to pay the medical bills. Eventually, I ended up here, pushing a cart, emptying trash cans. Invisible. Eleanor set down her glass. You're not invisible. With all due respect, ma'am, I've worked in this building for 11 years. Tonight is the first time you've ever spoken to me. The words landed like a slap. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She deserved them. She knew she did. You're right, she said. And I'm sorry for that. I've spent so long building walls that I forgot there were people on the other side of them. Vernon studied her face for a moment. The walls are because of your son? She nodded. His name was Thomas. He was a cellist. Incredibly talented. He could have gone professional, but he wanted to be a music teacher instead. He said he'd rather share the gift than hoard it. She smiled sadly. He was a better person than me. What happened to him? Leukemia. He was diagnosed when he was 17. We fought it for 2 years. Chemo, radiation, experimental treatments. We tried everything. Her voice cracked. He died 3 months before his 20th birthday. Vernon's face softened with understanding. I'm sorry. After he passed, I threw myself into work. Built this company from almost nothing. Told myself I was honoring his memory by being successful. But the truth is, I was just running from the grief, running from the guilt. Guilt? Eleanor walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights. I wasn't there when he died. I was in a meeting. A stupid meeting about quarterly projections. The hospital called, and by the time I got there... She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. That's not your fault, Vernon said gently. I know. At least, my head knows. But my heart never got the message. She turned back to face him. That's why I bought this piano. Thomas used to play Chopin all the time. It was his favorite. I thought if I had a piano nearby, it would be like having a piece of him still with me. But I could never bring myself to hire anyone to play it. It felt like a betrayal somehow. Like I was trying to replace him. So it just sat here, for 5 years, silent, gathering dust, until tonight. Vernon looked at the piano, then back at Eleanor. I'm sorry I played it without permission. I didn't know. Don't apologize. She walked closer to him, her heels clicking softly on the marble. You didn't play it without permission. You played it with purpose. That's different. She sat down on the bench next to him, leaving a respectful distance between them. Tonight is the first time I've heard music in this building since I bought that piano. And it's the first time I've cried since my son's funeral. Vernon didn't seem to know what to say to that. I've spent 23 years being strong, Eleanor continued. Being tough, being the Iron Lady. And you know what it got me? An empty office, an empty apartment, and a heart so frozen I forgot it could still feel. She looked at him, her eyes red but clear. Then you sat down at this piano with your broken hand and your trembling fingers, and you played music that was imperfect and messy and full of mistakes. And somehow, it was the most honest, beautiful thing I've ever heard. Vernon shook his head slowly. I don't understand why. It wasn't good. Not by any real standard. That's exactly why. Eleanor placed her hand gently on top of the piano keys. Not pressing. Just resting. Perfection is cold. It doesn't leave room for anything human. But what you played tonight, it had all your pain in it. All your loss. All your years of silence. That's not a flaw. That's a gift. Vernon stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his hands. really looked at them, like he was seeing them for the first time. "I gave up," he said quietly. 30 years ago, I gave up. I told myself I couldn't play anymore. So what was the point of trying? I let the music die." "It didn't die," Eleanor said. "It was just waiting. Waiting for the right moment. The right room. The right person to hear it. And you think that person is you?" Eleanor smiled. It was a small smile. Tired and sad. But real. "I think we both needed tonight. For different reasons. But we both needed it." Outside, the city kept moving. Cars honked. Sirens wailed in the distance. The world went on. Unaware of the two broken people sitting at a piano, in a room full of expensive furniture and forgotten dreams, Vernon took a deep breath. "I don't know what happens now." "Neither do I," Eleanor admitted. "But I know I don't want this to be the last time I hear you play." He looked at her, surprised. "You want me to play again?" "I want you to play for people who need to hear it. People like me. People who have forgotten what it feels like to be moved by something real." She paused. An idea forming in her mind. "Our company has a charity gala next month. 500 guests, some of the most powerful people in the city." Vernon's eyes widened. "Ma'am, I couldn't possibly." "Don't answer now." She held up her hand. "Just think about it. That's all I'm asking." He looked at the piano. Then, at his trembling hands. Then at her. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Eleanor nodded. And for the first time in 23 years, she felt something that might have been hope. The following Monday, Vernon arrived at work expecting everything to go back to normal. He pushed his cart through the hallways, emptied the trash bins, wiped down the desks. He stayed invisible, just like always. But something had changed inside him, and he couldn't quite put it back the way it was. He found himself thinking about the piano, about the way the keys had felt under his fingers after 30 years of silence, about Eleanor sitting on that couch with tears running down her face, telling him his broken music was beautiful. Nobody had ever said that to him before. Not since the accident. Not since his hands stopped cooperating, and his dreams crumbled like dry leaves. That night, he went home to the small apartment he shared with his wife. She was sitting in her wheelchair by the window when he walked in, watching the street below. Her name was Dolores, and she had been his rock for 32 years. Multiple sclerosis had taken her ability to walk 8 years ago, but it hadn't touched her spirit. She was still the strongest person he knew. "You're late," she said without turning around, "and you look different." Vernon hung up his jacket. "Different how?" "How?" "I don't know yet. Come here." He walked over and knelt beside her wheelchair. She studied his face the way she always did, reading him like a book she had memorized long ago. "Something happened," she said. It wasn't a question. So he told her. Everything. The piano in the executive lounge. The CEO who had listened. The conversation that had stretched past midnight. The invitation to the charity gala that he had promised to think about. When he finished, Dolores was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his trembling right hand in both of hers. "You played," she said softly. "After all these years, you finally played. It wasn't good. My hand. I don't care about good." Her eyes were fierce. "I care about you. I've watched you bury that part of yourself for 30 years. I've watched you pretend it didn't matter. And I've never said anything because I knew you weren't ready to hear it. But Vernon, the music never left you. It's been waiting. And now someone finally heard it." He didn't know what to say. His throat felt tight. "Are you going to do it?" Dolores asked. "The gala? I don't know. 500 people, Dolores. Rich people. Important people. They'll be expecting some fancy performer. Not a janitor with a broken hand. Or maybe they'll be expecting perfection and getting something better." She squeezed his hand. "When we got married, you promised me you'd never give up on your dreams. Remember? That was before the accident. Dreams don't have expiration dates." She smiled at him. that same smile that had made him fall in love with her 3 decades ago. "You've spent 30 years taking care of me, taking care of bills, taking care of everyone, except yourself. Maybe it's time to let yourself have something again." Vernon looked at their small apartment. The worn carpet, the second-hand furniture, the medical equipment that insurance barely covered. He had worked so hard just to keep them afloat. He had forgotten what it felt like to want something for himself. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Good," Dolores said. "That means it matters." The next few days passed in a blur. Vernon went to work, did his job, and tried not to think about the gala. But everywhere he looked, he saw that piano. He heard the music in his head, constant and unrelenting. And every night, he came home to Dolores, asking if he had made a decision yet. On Friday, he found an envelope on his cleaning cart. It was cream-colored and expensive, the kind of paper that felt heavy in your hands. His name was written on the front, in elegant handwriting. He opened it slowly, already knowing what was inside. It was a formal invitation to the Whitfield Financial Group annual charity gala. At the bottom, someone had written a note in blue ink. "The world needs to hear what I heard. Please say yes. E. 2. Vernon stared at the invitation for a long time. Then he put it in his pocket and kept working. That night, he called Eleanor's office. He had to go through 3 assistants before they finally put him through. "Vernon," she said when she picked up. There was warmth in her voice that surprised him. "I was hoping you'd call. I got the invitation. And," he took a deep breath, "I can't do it, ma'am. I'm sorry. I'm not the right person for this." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "May I ask why?" "Because I'm a janitor. Because I haven't performed in 30 years. Because my hand shakes so badly, I can barely get through a piece without making a dozen mistakes." He closed his eyes. "Because those people at your gala deserve better than me." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you meet me tomorrow?" "Same place. Same time. Ma'am, just one more conversation. That's all I'm asking. If you still want to say no after that, I'll respect your decision." Vernon thought about hanging up. He thought about going back to his invisible life, his safe routine, his quiet surrender. But something in her voice stopped him. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow." The next evening, Vernon found Eleanor already waiting in the executive lounge. She was sitting on the same couch as before, but she looked different somehow. Softer, less like the Iron Lady of Wall Street, and more like a tired woman carrying a heavy weight. "Thank you for coming," she said. He sat down across from her. "You didn't have to go through all this trouble. I already gave you my answer. You gave me your fear. That's not the same thing as your answer." She leaned forward. "Vernon, I've spent my whole career surrounded by successful people. Confident people, people who never doubt themselves and never show weakness. You know what they all have in common?" He shook his head. "They're boring." She smiled slightly. "They're polished and perfect and completely forgettable. Because perfection doesn't move people. It doesn't change anything. It just exists." She stood up and walked over to the piano, running her fingers along its polished surface. "The night you played, I felt something I hadn't felt in 23 years. I felt human. I felt connected to something bigger than spreadsheets and profit margins. And I realized that I've been so busy building this company that I forgot why I started it in the first place." "Why did you start it?" "Because after Thomas died, I needed something to fill the emptiness. I thought success would do that. I thought if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, accumulated enough, the hole in my chest would eventually close." She turned to face him. "It didn't. Nothing filled it. Until you sat at this piano and played music that was broken and beautiful and completely real." Vernon didn't know how to respond. 500 people are coming to that gala," Eleanor continued. "They have money. They have power. They have everything society tells us we're supposed to want. But most of them are empty inside. Just like I was. They've forgotten what it feels like to be moved, to be surprised, to witness something honest and vulnerable and true. She walked over to where Vernon was sitting and knelt down so they were at eye level. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be brave. Show them what courage looks like. Show them that broken things can still make beautiful music. Show them what I saw that night. Vernon's hands were shaking in his lap. What if I fail? What if I sit down at that piano and freeze up? What if I make a fool of myself in front of all those important people? Then you'll be human, Eleanor said simply. And that's more than most of them can say. He thought about Dolores at home, waiting for him. He thought about the dreams he had buried 30 years ago. He thought about all the nights he had walked past this piano, too afraid to even look at it. And then he thought about that night. The first note. The way the music had poured out of him, despite his trembling hand. The way it had felt to play again. Even imperfectly. Especially imperfectly. Okay, he said. The word came out small and scared. But it came out. Eleanor's face lit up. Okay? Okay. I'll do it. I'll play at your gala. She took his hands in hers, trembling and all. You won't regret this. Vernon looked at the piano, gleaming under the soft lights. In 3 weeks, he would sit at a bench in front of 500 strangers and play music he hadn't performed in 3 decades with hands that didn't work right anymore. He was terrified, but for the first time in 30 years, he was also alive. The night of the gala arrived faster than Vernon was ready for. 3 weeks of practice hadn't been enough. 30 years wouldn't have been enough. But here he was, standing backstage at the grand ballroom of the Whitfield Hotel, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit and trying to remember how to breathe. Through the curtain, he could hear the crowd. 500 people. Just like Eleanor had said. The clink of champagne glasses, the murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes and things Vernon had never owned and never would. These were the most powerful people in the city. Billionaires, politicians, celebrities, people who had never cleaned a toilet or pushed a mop or wondered if they could afford groceries next week. And in a few minutes, they were all going to watch him play. His hands were shaking worse than ever. He looked down at them, these broken instruments that used to create magic, and wondered what on earth he was doing here. A door opened behind him. He turned and saw Dolores being wheeled in by one of the hotel staff. Eleanor had arranged everything. A special entrance. A spot near the front, where Dolores could see the stage. She was wearing the blue dress Vernon had bought her for their 30th anniversary, and she looked beautiful. There's my star, she said, smiling up at him. Vernon knelt beside her wheelchair. I don't think I can do this. Yes, you can. My hands won't stop shaking. I can barely feel my fingers. What if I freeze up there? What if I... Dolores took his face in her hands, the way she had done 1,000 times before when he was scared or lost or ready to give up. Listen to me, she said firmly. You are not playing for them tonight. You're not playing for Eleanor, or for the cameras, or for anyone in that ballroom. You're playing for the 24-year-old boy who thought his life was over. You're playing for every night you sat alone in our apartment, wishing you could touch a piano again. You're playing for me. Her eyes glistened. You're playing for us. Vernon felt tears threatening to fall. He blinked them back. I love you, he said. I know. Now go show them who you are. He kissed her forehead, stood up, and walked toward the stage entrance. Behind the curtain, he could hear Eleanor's voice at the microphone. Tonight, I want to introduce someone special, she was saying. He's not a professional performer. He's not famous. Most of you have probably walked past him 100 times without noticing. But a few weeks ago, he reminded me of something I had forgotten. Something important. Vernon's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He reminded me that the most beautiful things in life aren't perfect. They're real. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vernon. No last name, no title, just Vernon. The curtain parted, and he stepped into the light. The ballroom was enormous. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting everything in a golden glow. Round tables filled the floor, each one decorated with flowers and candles and place settings that probably cost more than his monthly rent. And at every table, faces turned toward him. Curious, skeptical, some confused about why the entertainment for the evening appeared to be a nervous old man in an ill-fitting suit. Vernon walked to the grand piano at the center of the stage. It was a Steinway, just like the one in the executive lounge. He sat down on the bench and looked out at the sea of strangers. For a moment, his mind went completely blank. He couldn't remember the first note. He couldn't remember why he was here. All he could see were the eyes watching him, waiting for him to prove he didn't belong. Then he found Dolores in the crowd. She was sitting near the front, exactly where Eleanor had promised. And she was smiling at him. That same smile she had given him on their wedding day. The same smile she gave him every morning when he brought her coffee. The smile that said, "I believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself." Vernon placed his hands on the keys. They were shaking. They would always shake. But that was okay. He began to play. The first note of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata rang out across the ballroom. And immediately, Vernon knew something was different. This wasn't like practicing alone in the lounge late at night. This was something else entirely. The music filled the space, bounced off the walls, wrapped around every person in the room. His right hand trembled. He missed a note in the fourth measure. Then another in the eighth. The mistakes were there, just like he knew they would be. But he kept playing. He let the music carry him forward, let it pour out of his damaged hands like water from a cracked vessel. And somewhere around the second movement, something shifted. The whispers stopped. The champagne glasses stopped clinking. The room went completely still. And all Vernon could hear was the piano and his own heartbeat. He wasn't playing perfectly. He wasn't even playing well by the standards he used to hold himself to. But he was playing honestly. Every broken note carried 30 years of grief. Every trembling phrase held the weight of dreams lost and found again. He wasn't performing. He was confessing. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care who was listening. When he finished, his hands came to rest on the keys, and the last note faded into silence. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The ballroom was frozen. Vernon sat at the piano, suddenly aware of how exposed he was, how foolish this whole thing had been. Then Dolores started clapping. It was just her at first, alone in that vast room, her hands coming together in steady applause. Then Eleanor joined her. Then someone at a nearby table. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. 500 people, standing and clapping, some of them wiping tears from their eyes. The applause thundered through the room like a wave, washing over Vernon and filling every corner of his heart. He looked at Dolores. She was crying and laughing at the same time, clapping so hard her whole body shook in the wheelchair. He looked at Eleanor, standing at the side of the stage. She was crying too. But she was also smiling. A real smile. The kind that reaches your eyes and changes your whole face. The ovation lasted 4 full minutes. When it finally died down, Vernon stood up from the bench on shaky legs and gave a small bow. He didn't know what else to do. He had never been applauded like this, not even before the accident. That night, the gala raised $2.3 million for charity. Triple their usual amount. But that wasn't the part people talked about afterward. They talked about the janitor who played the piano. They talked about the music that made them feel something they couldn't name. They talked about the CEO who cried in public for the first time anyone could remember. In the weeks that followed, Vernon's life changed in ways he never expected. 17 people approached him about piano lessons. A reporter from the city's biggest newspaper wrote a feature story about him. A local music school offered him a part-time teaching position, but the biggest change came from Eleanor. She called him into her office one morning and offered him a new job, not as a janitor, as the director of a brand new foundation she was creating in her son's memory, the Thomas Chen Foundation for Music Education. Its mission would be to provide instruments and lessons to students with disabilities who couldn't afford them. Vernon tried to say he wasn't qualified. Eleanor told him that was exactly why he was perfect for it. He accepted. On his last day as a janitor, Vernon walked through the building one final time with his cleaning cart. He stopped at the executive lounge and looked at the piano. The same piano that had sat silent for 5 years. The same piano that had changed everything. He sat down at the bench, just for a moment. He played a few bars of Chopin. His hand still trembled. The notes still weren't perfect, but they were his. And that was enough. That evening, he went home to Dolores. She was waiting by the window, like always. "How was your last day?" she asked. Vernon smiled. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She took his hand, the broken one, and held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. "It always was," she said. "You just needed to remember." Outside, the city hummed with life. And somewhere in the distance, music was playing.